Greetings and welcome to episode 37 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation. We're in the middle of the book of Judges, Judges chapter 6 and 7. Remember, there are 7 judges, and there's a cycle that happens through the 300 years of the book of Judges. And we talked about Ehud and Deborah last week. We're talking about Gideon. We're talking about Gideon this week. And Gideon is fascinating because the story of Gideon is a story of precisely how God does not use strong and powerful people to do God's will. In fact, Gideon is really an unlikely hero. When you think of a hero, you'd think of someone who's strong and confident, able to leap tall buildings with a single bound. You think of someone that other people would look up to, someone that you would aspire to being like. But in our Judges story of Gideon, he is nothing of the sort. He doesn't have personal charisma. He does not have wealth. He's a bitter and weak farmer, and began his time, his call by God, as a faint-hearted weakling, one who had none of the characteristics of someone that we would look up to. That's who Gideon was, because when God spoke to him, Gideon was a weenie, a wimp. Far from a hero, Gideon was a faithless farmer and a fearful guy in Judges chapter 6, whose story begins when Gideon is hiding out in a wine press, threshing wheat there so he could hide it from the evil Midianites who were oppressing them. Gideon was hiding down in a wine press instead of an open flat place where they usually ground the wheat. They'd throw it up into the air, and then the chaff would go away, would blow away, and the wheat would fall. Well, Gideon begins God's vision for his life hiding out in that wine press as a discouraged, defeated, depressed farmer filled with doubts and fear, hiding in a wine press, threshing wheat. If you're looking for someone like a hero, it wouldn't be Gideon. Now, contrary to popular belief, Gideon isn't the Old Testament guy who put Bibles in hotel rooms and then stood at the back of church with an open Bible asking you to put a couple bucks in. The story of Gideon comes to us in Judges. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, where God set judges up to guide the people back to God. And they went through that cycle 7 times of rebellion and repentance and then restoration with God. With the leadership vacuum that happened after Joshua died, God turned toward the judges because people were doing what was right in their eyes, but not God's eyes. So that 300-year cycle, Gideon is in the middle of it. Samson, that we'll talk about in the next episode, is the last of the judges. So Gideon was the 6th judge of Israel. They were in their disobedience stage when Gideon began. They were doing evil in the sight of God and doing what they thought was right in their eyes. God punished them and put them in captivity under the evil Midianites for 7 long years. The people of Israel planted their crops and the evil Midianites ruined them. They raised their livestock and the evil Midianites killed them all. The people of Israel were so impoverished that they cried out to God for help. That's the context in which we meet Gideon, hiding out and beating the wheat in a wine press to hide from the evil Midianites. An angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon hiding out in that wine press, and he said, "Gideon, dude, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And Gideon, far from being a mighty warrior, Gideon says to the angel, "Hey, you got the wrong guy. My clan is the weakest in Israel. I'm the youngest in my family. Ain't me you're going after." Gideon says, "You need a mighty warrior to do this, and that's not me." Gideon wants nothing to do what God wanted with what God wanted to do with him. Gideon's discipleship following God was slow. Gideon didn't jump in with both feet. Gideon wanted God to lead the people into the God wanted Gideon to lead the people in the battle against the evil Midianites. Gideon was quite sure about that. So Gideon wanted to test God. God said, God, if you really want me, I'm going to put you to the test. I'm going to put out a lamb's fleece, and in the morning, if the fleece has dew on it, but the ground doesn't, then I'll follow you. So the next morning, there's dew on the fleece and dry ground. Gideon thought, okay, that was just luck. I'm going to try it again. Gideon says to God, God, if you're really serious tomorrow morning, make the ground wet, but the fleece dry. And the next morning, the ground was wet, but the fleece was dry. Gideon thought, okay, maybe I'll give this a chance. So the story of Gideon gets a little more interesting in chapter 7 of Judges, because it's there that Gideon starts following God a little bit more and became a leader of Israel's army, leading a huge group of 32,000 soldiers against the evil Midianite. 32,000. God says to Gideon, dude, 32,000 is too many, because if you go into battle with 32,000 soldiers, you'll win against the evil Midianites. And then people will say, well, that's because they had 32,000 soldiers and it's on their strength, so it's not reliant on me. So God says, Gideon, why don't you tell your soldiers that anyone who is just even a little bit afraid, why don't they go on home? So at the beginning of chapter 7, Gideon goes to the 32,000 soldiers and says, any of y'all want to go home, y'all go home. He probably didn't think too many people would take him up on that, but they started to leave one after the other, and all of a sudden, Gideon realizes that 22,000 of the 32,000 had gone home. All of a sudden, Gideon only has 10,000 soldiers against a Midianite army that was 3 times that big. So there they were, 10,000 soldiers remaining. God says, dude, Gideon, that's still too many. 10,000 is too many. Take your soldiers down to the water for a drink, and I'll tell you how to separate them. Gideon says to God, separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink. Now think of that. Of those 10,000, 9,700 knelt down and cupped their hands to drink. Only 300 knelt down like a dog on all fours and lapped the water. Excuse me, what is God up to? 10,000 thirsty soldiers go down to drink, and God wants Gideon to separate them from the way that they drank the water down at the lakeshore. And think about it, when you cup your hands to drink, you cup your hands to drink, bring it up to your mouth. Where are you looking? Down, right? How does a dog lap? A dog laps with the dog's face in, but with the eyes up, to see who's coming, right? Dog kind of laps, kind of looks around, because dog is always aware of what's going around them. So God said, take those 300 from the original 32,000, take those dog lappers, and those are the ones I'm going to work with. So Gideon thought, I had 32,000, now I've got 300. What am I going to do? And that again introduces us back to the what you got pattern. Remember, we talked about a number of episodes. What you got? Person says, ain't got much. God says, great, I can work with that. Remember Moses at the burning bush. God says, what you got? Moses said, ain't got much, I got a stick. God says, great, I can work with that. Shepherd boy, David, standing before Goliath. What you got? I got a couple of stones and a sling. God says, awesome, I can work with that. Joshua, like we talked about a couple episodes ago, God called him to overthrow Jericho. God said, what you got? They say, ain't got much. Got a pep band who used to play at rallies. God says, great, I can work with that. Then the miracle happens. When we ain't got nothing or ain't got much, when we admit that before God, but give God what we got, the miracle happens. So back to Gideon. Gideon was called to defeat the evil Midianites. He's got 32,000 soldiers, now is down to 3,000. Gideon says, I ain't got much, I got 300 soldiers. God says, awesome, I can work with that. So as Judges 7 continues, Gideon, with 300 soldiers, gathers them together and gives each one of them a trumpet and a lamp, okay? Now, back in those days, you would have one trumpet and one lamp for every 100 soldiers. So, do the math. Gideon's 300 soldiers now each have a trumpet and a lamp. One trumpet and one lamp used to represent 100 soldiers. Now Gideon's 300 with a lamp and a trumpet for each one of them, only 300 instead of 30,000. So those 300 soldiers, each one of them fully prepared, because remember, they drank the water, lapping it up like a dog, being aware of their surroundings. They went up in the hills surrounding the evil Midianites, and when the evil Midianites looked up to the hills and saw 300 lamps and heard 300 trumpets blaring, they would think, one per 100, that there's 30,000 soldiers coming against them. And the Midianites, in the mass confusion, turned crazy, turned on one another, and started killing one another, doing Gideon's work for him. And that's the way that Gideon overcame the evil Midianites, and the entire army of the Midianites were wiped out, and peace and prosperity reigned for the next 40 years, because Gideon, as a weenie, as a wimp, became a mighty hero because he responded to God's dream and God's call. Even though he ain't got much, he listened to where God was calling him. Because God calls us to do amazing things. And when we say, ain't got much, it's just me, it's just old me, God says, okay, I can use that. You know, I really like that about God. God sees in us what we cannot see in ourselves, and God will do for us what we could not do for ourselves. And the question for you is, what might God see in you? What might God do with you if you offered to God to do as God wills with the little that you have, and ask God to bless it according to God's will? What might you do if you knew that God could do for you what you could not do for yourself? You know, the truth be told, most of us are kind of like Gideon, thinking that God might work through other people, but not me. Not me. That's why it's so important to remember that no matter who you are, no matter where you've been, no matter what inadequacies that you have, God can use you if you fully embrace God's will and God's way for your life. You know, God can do amazing things if you're willing and able to open your heart, to think in your mind, God can use me, to open your heart to where God might use you. Our God is an awesome God and can and does do things through you if you just allow God to do that, to offer God whatever it is that you have and ask God to bless it. Make it a great day. Be grateful and smile. Look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Bye-bye.